The Alice Crimmins case broke in 1965 and grabbed headlines for the next 12 years. Like Joey Buttafuoco in the 1990s, the name of Alice Crimmins became synonymous with tabloid sensation in the latter half of the 1960s and most of the 1970s. This odd real-life mystery has been dealt with in several works. It was the subject of 2 true crime books, Kenneth Gross's The Alice Crimmins Case and George Capozzi Jr.'s Ordeal by Trial. It also inspired 2 best-selling novels. Both The Investigation by Dorothy Unack and Where Are the Children by Mary Higgins Clark are thinly veiled fictionalizations of the case. Where Are the Children was Clark's first published mystery. She'd previously authored a biography of George Washington and launched her prolific career in that genre. It was made into a movie of the same title that was released in 1986. A made-for-TV movie called A Question of Guilt, based on the Crimmins affair, was aired in 1978. It starred Tuesday Weld at both her most glamorous and most vulnerable. John Guare, author of the theatrical hits 6 Degrees of Separation and The House of Blue Leaves, wrote a Crimmins-inspired play called Landscape of the Body that opened in 1977. Neil Bell authored a play called Two Small Bodies that also opened in 1977. It was made into a film by Beth B. in 1994. The incident that would transfix the public for over a decade involved a previously obscure family with a sad, but in many respects all too familiar, family history. That family lived in the Queensboro of New York City and consisted of airline mechanic Edmund Crimmins, homemaker Alice Crimmins, and their children Eddie Jr., aged 5, and Alice Marie, always called Missy, 4. Edmund Crimmins was a 6-foot-tall, sandy-haired, and ruggedly handsome man who was starting to get a paunch and double chin. He towered over his wife Alice, a blue-eyed redhead with delicate features who was both slim and buxom. As couples usually are, the two had been very happy during the early years of their marriage. However, that marriage had crumbled in large part because Eddie spent very little time at home with his family. He preferred working overtime or drinking with the boys. Lonely and frustrated, Alice had found solace in a series of extramarital affairs. Their children have been described as well-behaved and cheerful youngsters. The two sometimes sat on the windowsill of their room, waving and saying hi to passers-by. Unlike many children who were born so close together, they didn't seem much afflicted by sibling rivalry. Missy was a girly girl, and her chubby older brother had adopted a protective attitude toward her, calling her My Missy. One time, another little boy pulled some hair from one of Missy's dolls. In a typically childlike way, Eddie interpreted an offense against one of his sister's toys as an attack on her, and he charged the larger boy, shouting, "Don't you ever touch my Missy! Don't you ever touch my Missy!" After they separated, Alice, who had previously been a full-time homemaker, had gotten a job as a cocktail waitress. Also, during their separation, she'd attended a bon voyage party, one that led to her husband's custody suit. The party was held on a boat, and Alice had attended it with Anthony Grace, one of her major boyfriends. He was a 52-year-old wealthy building contractor who sported a pencil-thin mustache and was given to silk suits and a diamond pinky ring. Short and thick-set, he had many friends amongst prominent New York City politicians and was rumored to have a few amongst its hoodlums. Grace and the other men had playfully locked the women in a washroom. Then the boat set sail. Unable to get off it, Alice Crimmins found herself on the way to the Bahamas at the very time when she should have been going home to relieve her children's babysitter. That babysitter called Edmund Crimmins, who immediately came to pick his kids up. He took them to the residence of his mother-in-law, Alice Burke, and decided that he'd file a suit for their custody. "You're not fit to bring up those kids," he angrily told their mother. The trial for that suit was only a week away. Her attorney had told her to expect a court agency inspection in connection with it, so Alice had spent much of the previous evening doing a lot of house cleaning and fixing up. However, on that hot, sunshiny morning of July 14, 1965, she found little Eddie and Missy were not in their rooms. She made a frantic phone call to Edmund, who strongly denied taking them, then went over to her place to help her look. Unable to find them, he called police to report that his children were missing. At the station house, one detective immediately wanted the case of the missing children. He was Detective Gerard H. Pearling, a 30-something father of 6 who sported an out-of-style crew cut and yearned to make second-grade detective. He and his more easygoing partner, George Martin, met both parents at the mother's residence. That residence was a ground-floor apartment in a working-class development of red brick called the Regal Garden Apartments. The Crimmins' home was modestly furnished but neatly kept. The window of the children's room was wide open, and a carriage was underneath the window. It appeared that Missy and Eddie had either been enticed out of the window or, as they'd done before, crawled outside on their own. When Pearling saw Alice Crimmins, the straight-laced Roman Catholic was instantly taken aback. Her children were missing, yet this mother was neither sobbing nor hysterical. Rather, she was heavily made up and sharply dressed, looking chic and sensuous in tight toreador pants and a flower-print shirt and high-heeled white shoes. Her short red hair was elaborately teased. By his own recollection, Pearling disliked her on sight, thinking, "She looks like a cold bitch to me." He told Martin, "You interview the guy. I'll take the bitch." Missy Crimmins was discovered a few hours later in a vacant lot. She had been strangled to death. Detective Pearling was informed that the body of a little girl matching Missy's description had been found, but didn't immediately inform the parents of the daughter's death. Rather, he decided to give the mother, whom he suspected, a sort of test. At her home, she stepped into a swarm of photographers, lights popping off in her face, and suddenly started sobbing. That settled it in the minds of the investigating officers. Alice Crimmins did not care about her children. Her swooning at her dead daughter's side was theatrical. She only cried on camera in a calculated attempt to simulate grief. Their very negative opinion of her would soon be reinforced the next morning when she kept the officers who wanted to question her waiting while she finished putting on her makeup. As Ken Gross wrote in the Alice Crimmins case, both police and public were outraged at the idea that a woman who was supposed to be in the ultimate stages of grief and anxiety, her son was still missing, was more concerned about her appearance. Her son's badly decomposed body was found several days after his sister's body. Then, within a week of the funeral, Alice Crimmins, mother of 2 small dead children, appeared to simply resume her normal life. Normal life, in this case, included not just doing household chores and cooking for herself and her husband. She and Edmund had reconciled, but evenings at bars and nightclubs where she drank and danced the nights away. Perhaps this behavior did indeed point, as so many believed, to an abnormally callous mentality and one that was capable of murder. Then again, all of it subject to less sinister interpretations. It's commonly accepted that shock can damn emotional expression. Perhaps the visual flash of camera bulbs suddenly jolted it out of Crimmins. Subsequent events would show Pearling hasty in judging the swoon as faked, since Alice would show a tendency to faint under most extreme pressure. There's a poignant explanation for her apparently obsessive concern with her appearance. It was an important part of her, the makeup, Gross wrote. Later it would be misunderstood, dismissed as cold vanity. But the adolescent acne of her well-scrubbed Catholic girlhood had burrowed into her a permanent feeling of inferiority. It would take her the better part of an hour, but that great affliction of her acne-scarred complexion would be disguised with expert care. Finally, her resumption of an active nightlife, and soon after that, an active extramarital sex life, might also be viewed as a coping mechanism. Just as she'd previously fought off loneliness through sensuality, so now she tried to escape an overwhelming grief with the pleasures of the flesh. Husband Edmund Crimmins had his own share of peculiar personality traits. Since their separation, he'd installed a wiretap on her phone and another wiretap from her bedroom to the basement so he could listen to her making love to other men when he surreptitiously entered the home. In one instance, he'd been in the basement while Alice was in bed with another guy. Edmund Crimmins had burst into the bedroom and chased the lover naked into the street. He'd sometimes sneak into the home when he knew she was not there, simply to be around the items she owned. Even more disturbingly, he told Alice that during their separation, he'd once exposed his genitals to some little girls in a park. Later, he claimed that he'd made up the story to ease Alice's guilty feelings about the demise of their marriage and make her think he was as bad as she was. However, whether the story was true or false, telling it certainly marks Edmund Crimmins as an odd man. But the cops saw Alice as the more sinister of the two. Part of the reason the police soon focused their attention on Alice was that Detective Peerling recalled seeing things that threw her story into question, and she remembered items conflicting with other people's reports. When Peerling first went to the children's room to investigate, he moved a lamp from the bureau over which the youngsters would have had to scamper on their way out the window. In doing so, he says he noticed a thin film of undisturbed dust over the top of it because the lamp itself left a clear round ring. However, Peerling didn't order the photographer to record this vital evidence, nor did he even make a written note of it. A photograph of the bureau showing a layer of undisturbed dust would be especially welcome since that area had seen some action recently, whether or not the kids scrambled over it. During her house cleaning, Alice had unbolted the screen because she'd found a hole in it, intending to replace it with the screen from her own bedroom. However, she found a bit of dog excrement on that screen, so she returned to the children's room and put the screen with the hole in it back in the window, but didn't refasten it to its bolts. She simply propped it against the glass. Later, in his frantic search for the children, Eddie Sr. had leaned out the window to yell for them. A floor plan of the Crimmins apartment. As Peerling would later recall, Alice told him that she'd fed the kids some manicotti, and he saw a slice of the same in the refrigerator and a box of frozen manicotti in the trash. He didn't save either bit of evidence, have it photographed, or make a note. However, when Alice talked to other detectives, she said that the kids had eaten veal that night. The autopsy showed that Missy's stomach contained pasta but no meat. Child molesters frequently pretend to be children's friends and caregivers. Could a pedophile have fed the kids before murdering them? Stranger things have been known to happen. Then again, perhaps Alice Crimmins was innocently mistaken. There were other conflicts between her recollection of that fateful evening's events and those of others. She recalled getting gas for her car at a Gulf station at 9 p.m. on the fateful evening. The two attendants remembered her being there around 5 p.m. However, this was a matter that was in and of itself irrelevant to the case. Then there was the issue of the precise time Missy died. It was initially determined by Dr. Richard Grimes by the temperature of the deep tissues of Missy's body that she died at least 6 to 12 hours before her body had been discovered, and perhaps earlier than that. The medical examiner's office was headed by Dr. Milton Hilpern, a respected coroner, and he'd been present at the little girl's autopsy. He found that the girl's stomach was quite full and concluded that she died no more than 2 hours after this meal. Alice claimed that on the fatal night, the family had eaten at 7:30 p.m., and she checked on the children at midnight. Was she lying? Was she mistaken? Or had the kids been kidnapped and fed a last meal of macaroni before they were killed? The public wondered and increasingly became critical of the authorities for not bringing the killer of the Crimmins kids to trial as the investigations continued for 2 more years. During those years, the cops followed Alice Crimmins constantly, watched her every move, and, as her own husband had, tapped her phone. They had good reason to expect such activity to bear fruit. If Alice was the killer, she'd have to have accomplices because the locations and times at which the bodies were found meant that someone else had transported at least one dead child. She'd been under constant surveillance when little Eddie's body was unceremoniously dumped in a vacant lot. Even if she was such a cold bitch that she never needed to unburden herself to anyone, her co-conspirator or conspirators would surely want to talk about payment or silence or both. But there were no such conversations. However, there was much to keep the police listeners entertained since Alice Crimmins and her many sweethearts engaged in sexually oriented conversations. The cops could count themselves doubly lucky, even by today's dial-a-porn standards, since they were being paid to listen to titillating sex talk. The cops also waged a campaign of embarrassment and harassment against Alice Crimmins in the hope that the tension might break her. During the months that she and Eddie were reconciled, police phoned him to let him know she was entertaining another man in the marital bedroom. They went to her various employers and informed them that the efficient secretary working for them under the name Alice Burke was actually the notorious Alice Crimmins, a promiscuous woman suspected in the deaths of her 2 young children, leading to her sudden firing. So Alice Crimmins went from one employer to another, working for a few weeks as a secretary here, a receptionist there, an airline travel agent on one occasion, and then inevitably unemployed and looking for work again. She drank more heavily and became increasingly hostile to the investigators she knew were trying to pin a double murder rap on her. She learned that her phone was tapped and began opening conversations with a message to the third parties listening. "Hi boys, drop dead." Finally, more than a year and a half after the Crimmins children were killed, the police believed they had an important break in the case. Sifting through the multitude of letters purporting to offer clues, they came across one dated November 30th, 1966, and addressed to then District Attorney Nat Hentel, that said as follows: "Dear Mr. Hentel, have been reading about your bringing the Crimmins case to the grand jury, and I'm glad to hear of it. May I please tell you of an incident that I witnessed? It may be connected and may not, but I'll feel better telling it to you. This was on the night before the children were missing. But as the press reported that the handyman saw them at the window that morning, it may not be related at all. The night was very hot and I couldn't sleep. I went into the living room and was looking out the window getting some air. This was at 2 a.m. A short while later, a man and woman were walking down the street toward 72 Road. The woman was about 5 feet in back of a man. She was holding what appeared to be a bundle of blankets that were white under her left arm and was holding a little child walking with her right hand. He now hollered at her to hurry up. She told him to be quiet or someone will see us. At that moment, I closed my window, which squeaks, and they looked up but didn't see me. The man took the white bundle and he heaved it into the back seat of the car. She picked up the little baby and sat with them in the back seat of the car. This woman was then with dark hair. The man was tall, not heavy, with dark hair and a large nose. This took place under a streetlight, so I was able to see it quite plainly. The car turned from the corner of 153rd Street onto 72 Road and out to Casena Boulevard. Please forgive me for not signing my name, but I'm afraid to. Wishing you the best of luck, a reader. P.S. About 1 hour later, I thought I saw just the man getting into a late model white car. The police were both elated. They knew that the report of a handyman seeing the kids at the window in the morning was unsubstantiated at receiving the letter and initially despairing at the probability of finding its author. However, they found a clue in the phrase, "down the street towards 72nd Road," that enabled them to narrow the search down to a reasonable block of residences. They then reduced that to those not having air conditioners beside the windows. The sleuths came up with a possible 39 apartments. Handwriting in the anonymous letter was compared with samples of complaint letters from those apartments, leading them to Sophie Iromirsky. Iromirsky was a middle-aged, heavy-set blonde who often suffered from insomnia. When the investigators interviewed her, they found her story somewhat revised from that in the fateful epistle. Sophie told the police that she now recalled the woman saying, "My God, don't throw her like that." While the letter described an incident that may be connected and may not, Sophie now identified the woman she had seen as Alice Crimmins. Iromirsky knew Alice from around the neighborhood, and Alice's photo was regularly in the newspapers, so it seemed rather odd that in the letter Iromirsky saw her only as a woman with dark hair and was uncertain as to whether the group she'd seen was even connected to the Crimmins case. However, the police were elated by Iromirsky's evidence and viewed it as just what they needed to secure an indictment. Drawing on Iromirsky's story, the investigators put together a scenario of a murderous mother aided by a man with mob ties. For some reason, Alice strangled Missy to death, they theorized. Perhaps Missy had intruded on Alice when she and a boyfriend were going at it hot and heavy. Alice had been murderously enraged, and her horrified lover had made a quick exit, never to be seen or heard from again. Alice had told Peerling that she'd made a phone call to a bar called the Capri that night and spoken to Anthony Grace. They decided that that call must have been about Missy's killing, and that Grace, eager to shield a lady love from the results of her impulsive actions, had placed a fatal call from that busy bar. He'd called a hoodlum and told the thug to go over to Crimmins' place to silence little Eddie. Iramirski had seen a dead Missy being carried in a blanket and her older brother obediently trudging to his doom. At the same time that investigators were tracking down the writer of an anonymous letter, they were applying pressure to Joseph Rorich, one of Crimmins' major boyfriends. The tall, muscular Rorich had chiseled features and wore his dark, wavy hair combed straight back from his forehead. He was a high-rolling, hard-drinking home repair contractor with a loud and blustering manner who'd lived a very compartmentalized life. There was the devoutly Roman Catholic family man with 7 children and the compulsive womanizer. Far more secretly, he was a bisexual who sought and enjoyed the company of men who cross-dressed. At the time of the Crimmins case, Joe Rorich was a man in serious trouble. His business dealings were going sour, and he was drowning in debt. His long-suffering wife had a job selling encyclopedias door to door. He'd written a raft of bad checks to attempt to hold off his creditors and was in serious legal trouble. Trying to stay one step ahead of cops and creditors, he'd taken to using a variety of aliases. The Crimmins case investigators put a wire on him to listen to his conversations with Alice, but she said nothing indicating culpability in the deaths of her children. The sleuths also repeatedly interviewed him. He recalled Alice talking about the custody suit and saying, "I'd rather see them dead than with Eddie." Had she actually murdered her kids so that her ex-husband wouldn't get custody of them? There were people willing to believe so. However, the investigators realized that a jury would regard this statement as hyperbole. Throughout several months of intense drilling, Rorich denied that she'd ever said anything directly incriminating. Then he received immunity from prosecution for all crimes except adultery and murder and changed his mind, recalling that she had told him something quite damning. On September 11, 1967, 2 years and 2 months after the deaths of little Missy and Eddie, Alice Crimmins was arrested for the first-degree murder of her daughter. She wasn't charged in her son's death because it couldn't be medically proven that he'd been murdered. The press, especially the tabloid press, had a field day with the case. Alice Crimmins was invariably called the ex-cocktail waitress, even though it was a position that she'd held for only a few months. As Ann Jones had noted, the word was used as a pejorative to sneer at Alice Crimmins and the whole category of women workers at once, despite her future attorney's sound judgment that it was actually a very hard job. But people see the tight-fitting, frilly outfit, not the constant waiting and serving. Crimmins' sexual escapades were raked over for both their titillation value and as a source of moral outrage. Front-page detective labeled her SexPot on trial and described her as an erring wife, a Circe, an amoral woman whose many affairs appear symptomatic of America's sex revolution. The courtroom trial began in May 1968 with Judge Peter Farrell, a long-nosed man with thinning silver hair, presiding. It was sensational in the extreme, partly because of the sex-related testimony and partly due to Crimmins' emotional outbursts. The physician who'd first inspected Missy's body when it was found in the lot was named Richard Grimes. He testified, "I saw the body of a girl who appeared to be about 5 years of age. She was clad in a cotton undershirt, a pair of yellow panties." "No!" The doctor's recitation was broken by a shout from Alice Crimmins, who began to weep. Judge Farrell demanded order and told Dr. Grimes to continue. "Around the little girl's face, there was a cloth tie," Dr. Grimes said. "The loose ends of the tie appeared to be the arm of some type of garment. The tie was over the mouth of the child, the knot encircling the neck, and the tie was rather loose." Alice Crimmins, supposedly a cold and unfeeling woman, wailed and sobbed uncontrollably during this testimony. A few spectators started crying with her, and the judge put the court in recess. A different kind of explosion from Alice took place during Joe Rorich's testimony. Rorich had to be repeatedly reminded to speak up as he testified in what was for him an oddly subdued voice. He told the packed courtroom that prior to the murders, Alice had discussed Eddie's custody suit and had speculated that she might simply take off with them if she thought she might legally lose them. He also repeated her statement that she'd rather see them dead than with Eddie. Later, he said that the two lovers had been talking about the children, and a teary-eyed Alice had sadly said, "Joseph, please forgive me. I killed her." At this testimony, Alice Crimmins leapt to her feet and screamed, "Joseph, how could you do this? This is not true. Joseph, you of all people. Oh my God." Sophie Iramirski may have been the trial's most dramatic witness. On direct examination by prosecutor James Mosley, she told how she'd seen a woman carrying a bundle, a man, and a little boy on that sleepless night at the window. He took the bundle and he swung the bundle under his arm and he walked very quickly to the car. Iramirski testified as the courtroom listened in hushed anticipation. He took this bundle and threw it in the back seat of the car. She ran over to him and she said, "My God, don't do that to her." And then he looked at her and said, "Now you're sorry?" And she said, "Please don't say that." When asked if she recognized the woman in the courtroom, Iramirski didn't hesitate. She pointed an accusing finger at Alice Crimmins and said, "That's the woman." Again, Alice jumped to her feet screaming. "You liar, you liar," the defendant thundered. "You liar, you liar, you liar, you liar." Judge Farrell pounded his gavel and demanded Alice Crimmins get a grip on herself. One of Crimmins' attorneys, Martin Barron, tried to point out inconsistencies between the story she related to this jury and what she told to the grand jury. However, Sophie was very popular with the courtroom audience, most of whom were strongly convinced of Crimmins' guilt. The spectators often laughed or even applauded at her answers until the judge admonished them that this is not the hippodrome. She held up well under cross-examination and during a court recess triumphantly held up her hands in a boxer's salute. At her first trial, Alice Crimmins took the witness stand in her own defense. She spoke in a thin voice that didn't carry well, so the judge recessed the court until the next day so a microphone could be installed in front of her. Barron took her through her background and marital troubles. When the questions turned to her children, Crimmins began to shake uncontrollably, and tears began streaming down her heavily made-up face. Judge Farrell declared a recess, but the trial had to be postponed until the next day because Crimmins had fallen into a semi-faint. She repeated the story she told the police of her activities on the terrible night her children disappeared. She strongly denied that she'd ever confessed killing Missy to Joe Rorish. Crimmins was aggressively and belligerently cross-examined by prosecutor Tony Lambardino. Due to the rules of evidence in New York courtrooms, he had complete leeway to delve into anything that might reflect adversely on her character, even if it had no direct connection to the issues at trial. He used that leeway to bring out every possible detail of Alice Crimmins' active love life. This was 1968, when the sexual revolution was in its infancy, and the working-class people of Queens were outraged by active non-marital sex, especially by a woman. Some of their exchanges were quite lurid. Lambardino established that Crimmins knew a fellow named Carl Andrade, and that he'd visited her at 1 a.m. during their separation from Eddie when the children were in their room sleeping. Lambardino: where specifically in your apartment was Andrade? Crimmins: in my bedroom. Lambardino: where were you, Mrs. Crimmins? Crimmins: in the bedroom with him, sir. Lambardino: I see. Did your husband come into the apartment that morning? As previously noted, Eddie Crimmins was often unknown to Alice in the basement of the home, listening to her activities through the wiretaps he'd installed. Crimmins: yes, he did. Lambardino: what did he do when he got there? Crimmins: we weren't doing anything at that moment. Lambardino: you weren't doing anything? How was Carl Andrade dressed? Crimmins: he was in a state of undress. Lambardino: will you tell the men of this jury panel what you mean by a state of undress? Crimmins: just what I said, sir, a state of undress. Lambardino: what was your condition of attire? Crimmins: I was also in a state of undress. Lombardino: Did your husband see Carl Andrade? Crimmins: Yes, he did. Lombardino: What did he do when he saw Carl Andrade? Crimmins: They had a scuffle and Eddie chased him. Lombardino: Was Andrade in a state of undress when Eddie chased him? Crimmins: Yes, he was. Lombardino: How did he get his clothing, Mrs. Crimmins? Crimmins: I got dressed and brought them out to him. Lombardino: Where was he when you brought him his clothes? Crimmins: In his car. In another particularly damaging exchange, Lombardino was able to juxtapose the pitiful deaths of her children with the apparently callous hijinks of their promiscuous mother. Lombardino: Does Joe Rorish have a swimming pool? Crimmins: He does. Lombardino: Did you swim in it? Crimmins: Yes, I did. Lombardino: What were you wearing when you swam in Joe Rorish's pool? Crimmins: One time a bathing suit, one time no bathing suit. Lombardino: And where were your children while you were swimming in Joe Rorish's pool without a bathing suit? Crimmins: They were dead. Alice Crimmins left the stand on shaky legs. She knew that she'd damaged herself in the eyes of the conservative, old-fashioned men who made up the jury, and indeed one of the jurors, Sam Ehrlich, commented to another that a tramp like that is capable of anything. In its summation to the jury, the prosecution hypothesized that Alice had killed her daughter in momentary anger. The jury came back with a verdict of guilty of first-degree manslaughter. The shock of the verdict caused Crimmins to lapse into a coma. She was in the jail hospital for 2 weeks after her conviction. Transferred to prison, she became briefly hysterical, then appeared to settle down into prison routine. She was assigned to secretarial chores, and, as she had in the free world, performed them in an excellent manner. Her attorneys were soon back in court asking for a mistrial. 3 of the jurors, one of them the Sam Ehrlich quoted above, had made trips to the crime scene despite the judge's warning that they were not to visit it. The court denied the motion for mistrial and sentenced Crimmins to a prison term of from 5 to 20 years. Crimmins got a new lawyer, Herbert Lyon, an attorney well known and well respected in New York City. Many people were perplexed that he took the case, however, because he was an expensive lawyer and she was a pauper. Her family savings had been spent paying for her first set of defense attorneys. It turned out that Lyon and his partner, William M. Erlbaum, had taken on the case for idealistic reasons. They were completely convinced of her innocence and were working for her free of charge. Lyon asked a Queens County Supreme Court judge for bail on the grounds that there was a good chance the conviction wouldn't stand. It was granted, and after 24 days in prison, Alice Crimmins was free. The appellate court did not get around to considering the appeal until a year and 4 months later. They threw the conviction out. The second trial began in March 1971, 6 years after the deaths of the Crimmins children. This time, the stakes were even higher than they had been in the first trial, for Alice had been indicted in both deaths. She was charged with a first-degree murder of her son, Eddie, and first-degree manslaughter in the death of Missy. The earlier verdict in Missy's case had in effect acquitted her of the girl's murder. Public sentiment had shifted somewhat. Female promiscuity was no longer as shocking as it had been only 3 years previously. The women's liberation movement was a hot item in 1971, and some early feminists, as well as other observers, believed that Crimmins was being tried for her sex life and not for homicide. Not surprisingly, Alice Crimmins, whose self-esteem was so intimately tied to her appearance and who was so very dependent on men, was far closer to Maribel Morgan than Gloria Steinem in her beliefs about sex roles. Asked what she thought of feminism, she replied, "Oh, I'm for equal pay for equal work, but not for all that far-out stuff. I don't hate men. I believe that women are put on this earth to serve men. A man should be dominant. I believe in women's liberation, but not at the price of my femininity." This trial would become, as writer Ann Jones noted, a snarl of charge and countercharge. Moreover, the years of her ordeal had taken a toll on Alice Crimmins. She remained a shapely and attractive woman, but she had a hunted, hounded look. She also lost control of herself even more often during her second trial than her first. While Prosecutor Thomas DeMacos was questioning prospective jurors, he commented, "She's presumed to be innocent, but she's not innocent." Alice cried out, "I am too innocent. You know I'm innocent." The bespectacled and balding judge, George J. Balbach, told the prosecutor to avoid making such assertions when he was interviewing potential jurors. Later, the other prosecutor, Vincent Nicolzi, said in his opening statement that on the last evening of their lives, their mother fed them manicotti. Alice said, "I did not." Edmund Crimmins, now divorced from Alice, testified in this trial as he had in the last. While he said nothing that implicated his ex-wife, he stated that he had no feeling for her, really. Once again, Detective Peerling testified, recalling the unrecorded dust on the bureau and the vanished manicotti box in the trash as clearly as before. This time, he added something previously unmentioned. He claimed that Alice had told him that during the trip to the gas station, the children were acting up in the back of the car and she swung and hit the girl. Lyon was instantly on his feet, asking for a mistrial. He pointed out, correctly, that it's not unusual for parents to use corporal punishment, but said that bringing it out in the trial was prejudicial. His motion was denied. Anthony Grace took the stand, and the prosecutor often seemed to be placing Alice's beau on trial, repeatedly asking Grace if she'd requested any help and if Grace had sent anyone over to that apartment that particular night. Grace denied firmly that he'd had anything to do with the children's deaths. Detective John Kelly testified that he'd had a conversation with Alice Crimmins about possible immunity in her son's death and a good deal on the charges related to her daughter if she'd tell the whole truth. He said that she'd told him she'd have to talk it over with her lawyer. He also testified that she'd complained about many of the prosecution's witnesses lying in her first trial. He recalled retorting, "If all those people lied, why didn't I lie?" She supposedly told him, "Well, maybe the DA couldn't make you lie." This provoked another Alice outburst. "But he did now." Once again, Sophie Iramirski gave dramatic testimony about the group that she'd supposedly seen from her window. Again, she was asked to identify the woman. "Alice Crimmins," she replied. Alice Crimmins stood and shouted, "It is not, you liar! In God's name, tell the truth!" The judge gavelled for order, and Crimmins continued screaming, "You liar! You swore to tell the truth up there! Do you know what the truth is? You're so sick you don't know how to tell the truth." Again, the judge called for Crimmins to get a grip on herself. D.A. DeMacos asked Iramirski, "Was it Mrs. Crimmins you saw out there that night?" "I swear to God," Iramirski replied. "You swear," Crimmins cried. "It wasn't me. I didn't do it. You don't know what God is." The judge declared a recess. Lyon attempted to cast doubt on the witness's veracity by raising doubts about her mental health. He questioned her about the accident at the World's Fair, something which had occurred only 9 months prior to her fateful night at the window. "There's nothing to it," Iramirski said. "I reached down to take my pocketbook from a little bin and a mouse ran up my arm and I fainted." "A mouse?" Lyon asked. "Yes, a mouse," Iramirski replied, nonplussed. "You know, a little itty-bitty thing with a tail on it. A mouse." Both spectators and jurors rocked with laughter while the judge brusquely called for order. Asked if she'd reported the mouse was yellow, Iramirski replied, "Because upstairs in the gourmet shop they had a giant cheese which all the mice used to eat, and the cheese was yellow and the mouse was yellow. Yes, sir." Iramirski smiled in delight at the titters her story elicited. She denied that the time she'd overdosed on tranquilizers was a suicide attempt. Lyon pointed out that her stomach had been pumped. "That's right," a smiling Iramirski readily agreed. "And then I went with my husband across the street to a diner and had a hamburger." Lyon questioned Iramirski about the extensive and dramatic dialogue she testified that she'd heard. He asked her to point to where those people were, and she indicated a spot 150 feet from her window. Lyon then showed a diagram from the first trial in which Irmirsky had placed the people some 60 feet farther from her vantage point at her window. Were they speaking loud? Were they yelling? Lyon rather understandably wondered. No, in normal tones, Irmirsky replied. And from 200 feet away, you heard them talking in normal tones? Lyon asked in amazement. That's not unusual, Irmirsky informed him. My girlfriend, I hear from the window when she asks me what I want from the store. Lyon asked where the girlfriend lived, and Irmirsky went to the diagram and pointed to an apartment some 200 feet away from hers. The acoustics carry differently in that area because we're downhill, Irmirsky told him. And if your girlfriend calls you in a normal tone from her window, and you're in your kitchen, you can hear her? Of course, the unflappable Irmirsky replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, before again strutting in the courtroom hallway with her hands clenched in a boxer's salute. Once again, Joe Rorish took the stand to claim that Alice said, "Forgive me, Joseph, I killed her." A weeping Crimmins shouted, "You miserable lying worm!" Then Rorish said what he could not say at the first trial, when Crimmins was being tried for the death of the girl only. Rorish stated, "She said then, I didn't want him killed. I agreed to it." A surprise witness soon appeared. As the courtroom listened in stunned silence, a short and skinny housewife named Tina DeVita testified that she'd seen a group consisting of a man carrying a bundle, a woman, a dog, and a boy walking on 150th Street in the area of the Regal Gardens apartments. Alice Crimmins listened with widened eyes and gasped as she heard this testimony. During a recess, Crimmins approached reporters to make an obvious, desperate plea. "I've come here to make an appeal," she began in a shaky voice. Tears blurred her blue eyes. Alice Crimmins was clearly terrified. "I'd like anybody that lived in my neighborhood to come forward," she said. "Anybody that lived in my neighborhood who might know something about what happened on the night of July 13th or the morning of July 14th. I'm asking for anyone that was out that morning between 1:30 and 2:30. Anybody that saw something or didn't see something. It doesn't make a difference either way. It's just as important to me if they didn't see something or if they did see something. They're coming with people for 6 years. Now, I don't know where these people are coming from, but I'm asking for help from my side." Crimmins' voice cracked, and it seemed like she might collapse into sobs, but she managed to choke it out. "I need that help because I did not kill my children. Anybody that just didn't see anything is just as important to me as someone who might have seen something. I didn't kill my children. I swear I didn't kill them." The prosecutors were furious. Crimmins had been ordered by the court to refrain from press interviews. The judge warned her lawyers that if she broke that order again, Crimmins' bail would be revoked and she'd be slammed behind bars. The next day, another surprise witness appeared. This time it was the prosecution side that was stunned by the testimony. That witness was Marvin Weinstein, a travel agency manager who claimed that he'd been walking on 153rd Street in the wee hours of July 14th of 1965. He'd been visiting a friend named Anthony King. "Who was with you?" Lyon inquired. "My wife, my son, my daughter, and my dog," Weinstein answered. He went on to say that his son was 3.5 at the time and his daughter was 2 years old. Weinstein had carried his little girl in his arms, wrapped in a blanket. Weinstein's wife appeared in the courtroom, and she bore more than a passing resemblance to Alice Crimmins. Had Alice Crimmins' desperate gambit paid off? Many observers believed so. After all, if the group seen by Irmirsky and DeVita was not Alice Crimmins and a shadowy hitman with a doomed little Eddie and a dead Missy, but the Weinstein family, the primary basis upon which the prosecutors first drew up their indictment so many years ago would collapse. Did it? Anthony King came into the court and said that the Weinsteins had not visited him that night. Lyon cast doubt upon King's testimony by bringing out that he and Weinstein had once been friends and business partners, but were now personal enemies. He then brought in a witness who had told the court that King was a notorious liar. Vincent Colabella, the gangster said to have been the hitman, was brought into court by the Crimmins' attorneys. Tall, handsome, and swarthy, Colabella had a lengthy and serious criminal record. The arrogant career criminal denied knowing Alice Crimmins, Anthony Grace, or even having ever been to Queens. The prosecutors tore into him but were unable to get any sort of admission out of him. The trial was winding down, and the Crimmins' attorneys were in a quandary. Should Alice take the stand in her own defense? They knew that although they were admonished not to, juries hold it against defendants when they remain silent. However, they also knew that the last time she'd been on the stand, she'd been hammered at because of her sex life, and that had, and probably would again, prejudice a largely working-class, middle-aged, and old-fashioned jury. Herb Lyon asked for a meeting in the judge's chambers. He requested that the justice rule that Alice could not be questioned about her sexual history during cross-examination. The judge refused to do so. Alice didn't take the stand. Lyon's summation was eloquent and impassioned. He decried the prosecution's case as a bunch of garbage. He described Rorich as a man scorned. Anthony Grace replaced Rorich in Mrs. Crimmins' affections, Lyons told the jury. He can't match Anthony Grace in business, and now he'd lost out to him with Mrs. Crimmins. Iramirski started this whole thing, Lyon said, and I'm going to finish it. I don't care if Mrs. Iramirski's compensation case runs into a big award, but I do care when it runs into a murder case. He pointed out the way her recollections dramatically changed from the letter about something that may not be connected at all, and noted that a doctor's report said that Iramirski had neurotic tendencies to subconscious exaggeration. He asked the jury to ponder Iramirski's bizarre assertions that she could hear people talking in normal tones from 200 feet away. I don't know if you need a doctor to explain that kind of hearing, he said. This is worse than the yellow mouse. Finally, Herb Lyon wound up with a moving plea on behalf of a client he strongly believed had been grievously wronged. Mrs. Iramirski said she heard the child crying from their grave. If they're crying from their grave, they're saying, "Let our mother go. You have had her long enough. 6 years of torture. In addition to loving us, she's accused of killing us. 6 years, based on a letter that comes anonymously, based on a snake who stings like a viper, and based on a misconception of the analysis of the food." Thomas Demakos was no less passionate in his people's summation. He told the jury, "She doesn't have the courage to stand up here and tell the world she killed her daughter." "Because I didn't kill my daughter," Crimmins wailed. "And the shame and the pity of it is that this little boy had to die too," Demakos said. He ridiculed the idea that she was being persecuted. If the people think that all the district attorney's office has to do is go out and frame a woman for publicity, then God help this country of ours. The jury came back with the harshest possible verdict: guilty of first-degree murder in Eddie Jr.'s death and first-degree manslaughter in that of Missy. Many in the courtroom burst into tears. Alice sobbed, "Dear God, no. Please, dear God." Her mother, Alice Burke, wailed, "Sweet Jesus, no, not again." John Burke, her brother, said, "She didn't kill her children. She didn't kill them." Her ex-husband, Edmund Crimmins, cried, "This isn't justice," as tears streamed down his cheeks. A male spectator who had sent Alice a greeting card with the message, "We're with you, Alice," only one day before, shouted, "They ought to kill the jury," as he fell into tears. Herb Lyon appeared stunned in defeat, saying, "I guess I convinced everyone but the jury." The second trial of Alice Crimmins ended, and Crimmins went to prison for what was assumed would be the rest of her life. She'd served more than 2 years behind bars when she was released in 1973. The Appellate Division of the Supreme Court in Brooklyn reversed her conviction in Eddie Jr.'s case, ruling that there is no evidence of murder. It also reversed the manslaughter conviction in Missy's case because Demakos' assertion that she doesn't have the courage to stand up here and tell the world she killed her daughter suggested that a defendant who exercised the right to refrain from testifying was admitting guilt. The DA appealed both rulings. In the meantime, Alice was free on $25,000 bail. Then, in February 1975, the Court of Appeals upheld the reversal of the murder conviction, but reinstated the manslaughter conviction and sent her back to prison. Even that was not the end of the Crimmins saga. In 1977, a New York tabloid broke the story that she was participating in a work release program, and like other inmates in the program, she was allowed every other weekend free. She'd also been permitted to marry Anthony Grace. The newspaper showed Mrs. Alice Grace with her husband on board a yacht. The next day, its cover featured another picture of the furloughed Mrs. Grace about to step into her husband's white Cadillac. New York politicians cried out that she shouldn't be paroled, but in November 1977, after more than 3 years of imprisonment, she was released. Although free, she still wanted vindication, but her appeal for a new trial was denied, and the courts ruled that she could appeal no further. A close, objective look at the matter shows that despite 2 convictions, the guilt of Alice Crimmins remains problematic. For one thing, the case was solved with major loose ends dangling. According to the prosecution's own theory of the crime, the mother could only have murdered with the help of at least 2 accomplices, yet no one else was ever even charged, much less tried, in connection with the deaths. At the time when the issue of memory and its reliability is so prominent, when false memory syndrome versus recovered memory is debated by psychologists in the courts, the Crimmins case takes on a special relevancy because the trustworthiness of the human memory played an extraordinary role in it. First, there was the strange certainty of Alice Crimmins' own memory. She said that she'd fed her kids veal at 7:30 p.m. on the evening of July 13, 1965. Then she'd taken them for a ride, gassed up her car at 9 o'clock, returned home, and put them to bed. She looked in on them at midnight and took little Eddie to the bathroom. Missy had stayed in bed because she didn't have to go. After returning the boy to bed, she attached the hook and eye latch that she'd put on the door. This lock, Crimmins said, was to stop the chubby boy from raiding the refrigerator at night. The cops thought it was to prevent either child from walking in on their mother when she was with a boyfriend. Then she fell asleep in her clothes, awakened, walked her dog, took a bath, and finally retired for the night at 4 o'clock a.m. Questioned repeatedly about these mundane events, Crimmins remained stubbornly positive. No, she could not possibly be off by, say, an hour as to the time they ate. She checked on them at midnight, no earlier, no later. When 2 gas station attendants said that she'd come to the station at 5:30 p.m., she called them liars, refusing to acknowledge that she might be in error about a matter that was in and of itself irrelevant. The veal or macaroni question is one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Many observers, including most importantly 2 juries, have found Crimmins' insistence that she fed her children veal and the medical examiner's failure to find meat in Missy's stomach utterly damning. However, one must ask why Crimmins would make up such a story. As writer Albert Borowitz has noted, it's highly unlikely that Crimmins knew enough about forensics to deliberately create such an enigma. Furthermore, she specified buying it that very day at a deli at which she was well known and where her story could be checked out. As it happened, the deli owner couldn't remember what she'd bought, but there was no way she could bank on that. Nor could she know that Peerling would not better preserve or record the crime scene. Detective Gerard Peerling was so confident in his memory that he forgot more substantive methods of evidence gathering, like taking photographs, making notes, or just preserving it. Joe Rorish and Sophie Iramirski also had fascinating memories. In the first trial, Rorish testified that his ex-girlfriend had confessed, "I killed her." Since Crimmins was accused of killing her daughter only, tying her to the death of her son would have been grounds for a mistrial. Thus, if she'd told him, "I killed my kids," it would have been inadmissible. If she'd confessed to the killing of Missy only, Rorish would have been of no extra value in that second trial. But he testified at that event that Alice Crimmins had told him, "Forgive me, Joe, I killed her," and "I didn't want him killed, I agreed to it." This precise wording that Crimmins used, at least as he remembered the conversation, gave Rorich's testimony maximum prosecutorial impact at both events. The memory of Sophie Iramirski seemed to grow with time. In her initial epistle, she said she had seen something which may be connected, or then again it may not. By the time she testified before a grand jury, Sophie Iramirski not only knew with certainty that the woman was Alice Crimmins, but recalled dramatic dialogue, even though she'd heard it from some 200 feet away. Moreover, there's something inherently fishy about that family grouping. Albert Borowitz asks if, having just witnessed his sister's death, little Eddie would so very passively have gone to his own. Perhaps it's even more unbelievable that he would not have shown more concern for the bundle that his mother carried. At 5 years old, he would not have developed the defense mechanism against emotional displays that most adult males, and some females like Alice Crimmins herself, acquire. Wouldn't he have been crying in his grief? Wouldn't he have been demanding to hold the little sister he loved so dearly and so protectively? Was Alice Crimmins railroaded? Not quite. As Anne Jones wrote, she was granted no presumption of innocence. The common prejudice against sexually adventurous women tipped the scales of justice towards conviction and blackened her name. While she lives out the rest of her life in freedom and anonymity, as well as, perhaps, the material comfort and security of her second husband's affluence, in the annals of murder cases, she remains Alice Crimmins, child killer. There's a crying need for closure and solution when an outrage has been committed, and that's especially true when the victims are children. However, to those who take the time and trouble to familiarize themselves with the details of the Crimmins case, the deaths of little Eddie and Missy remain that most frustrating of puzzles, an intractable mystery.